My cousin got my wife pregnant. My parents, my aunt, my uncle, and my grandmother all knew before I did. They didn't call me. They didn't warn me. They sat in each other's living rooms and decided, together, that the best approach was to manage me when the time felt right. Not for my sake. For theirs. So I gave every single one of them exactly what they had given me. Nothing. I'm going to tell you the whole story. Because I have never told it to anyone outside of a handful of people who earned the truth. My name is Mason. I was 36 when it happened. I worked as a first officer for a regional carrier, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, transitioning into captain training. The job meant I was gone, 4, sometimes 5 days at a stretch, then home for 2 or 3. It's the rhythm of airline work. You adapt to it or you leave. I had adapted. I thought my wife had too. Her name was Erin. She ran a small event planning business out of a studio near uptown Charlotte. Weddings, corporate galas, private parties. She had the kind of energy that made clients feel like they were her only client. Organized down to the smallest detail. Charming when she needed to be. Beautiful in that low-key way that made men trust her and women like her. We had been together 7 years, married for 4. She was good at her job. She was good at a lot of things I didn't know about. My cousin Drew was 3 years younger than me and about 15 years behind in the part of his brain that processed consequences. He was my Aunt Peggy's son. My mother's sister's kid. Close family by every measure. Every holiday, every birthday, every backyard gathering, where the same people rotated through the same conversations. Drew was charming in that loose, untethered way. That worked well at parties, and very badly in real life. He bounced between personal training clients, fitness content online, and asking people with actual income for loans he had no realistic plan to repay. I had lent him money twice, $1,000 once, $1,500 another time. He swore he would pay it back before the end of the year, both years. I stopped keeping track after 3 years passed. I helped him because he was family. That was the whole reason, and the only reason. I should have thought harder about that, before this story had a reason to be told. I came home 14 hours early on a Tuesday in October. We'd been held on the ground in Columbus due to a maintenance write-up on the number 2 engine bleed, and once the repair stretched past midnight, crew rest rules kicked in and operations deadheaded us home on a morning flight. I was in Charlotte by 10 a.m., instead of midnight the following day. I didn't call Erin. I wasn't trying to catch anyone. I was just tired, hungry, and glad for the extra hours. Drew's Jeep was in my driveway. Silver, cracked left taillight I had seen at every family function for the past 2 years. Parked directly behind Erin's car like it had been there long enough to find its place. I sat at the end of the driveway in my car for a long time. Your brain becomes a defense attorney when your gut is preparing to testify. He was in the neighborhood. His gym was nearby. Something was wrong with his car again, and Erin had driven him somewhere. There were explanations. Reasonable people constructed explanations before they drew conclusions. The front door was unlocked. I let myself in the way I always did, quiet out of habit, not intent. I heard her laugh before I reached the kitchen. Not a polite laugh. Not the kind that belongs to a conversation you can explain later. The kind that lives between 2 people who have been alone together long enough to stop performing. I stood in the hallway for about 4 seconds. Then I turned around, walked back out the front door, got in my car, and drove away. I want to be accurate about what happened in those 4 seconds, because people will have opinions. I did not go through that door. I wanted to. The wanting was loud and specific, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. There was a moment. And it lasted a real countable number of seconds. Where my hand was on the door to the garage. And I understood exactly what I would do if I went back inside and found what I knew I was going to find. I understood it clearly enough that I also understood what would come after. The story would become about that. It would stop being about what Drew did, what Erin did, what every person in that kitchen at my parents' house had already silently agreed to. I put my keys back in my jacket pocket and drove to an airport hotel and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall until it got dark outside. The next afternoon, I came home as if nothing had happened. Erin was at her studio. I had the house to myself and I started with the joint checking statements going back 8 months. There were Venmo transfers to Drew, small amounts at first, $40, $60, $80. Then larger, one for $220, listed as groceries. Another for $300 with no note. When I had asked Erin about those months ago, she said Drew was going through a rough patch and she was just helping out occasionally. He's your cousin, she had said. He doesn't have anyone else to ask. He doesn't have anyone else to ask. That sentence had seemed kind at the time. I found the rest on her laptop, which she had left open on the kitchen counter while she showered. Her passcode was the name of the street where we had lived when we first met. She had never changed it. I spent a moment with that fact before I kept reading. The messages went back 6 months. Some of what I read I have no intention of repeating. What I will say is this: 6 months of scheduling around my flight rotations. 6 months of what I can only describe as a parallel version of the life I thought we were living. And somewhere in the last 3 weeks, a shift in tone. A message from Aaron. I need to tell you something and I'm scared. Drew's response. Me too. Can you come over tonight? That exchange was 12 days before I came home to his Jeep in my driveway. I found the test in the bathroom cabinet, pushed behind a box of allergy medication she never used. Positive. Still in its packaging, like she couldn't decide whether throwing it away made something more real or less. I put it back exactly where I had found it. Then I went and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard and thought about the raised garden bed I had built along the fence. The summer before. The one Erin said she wanted for tomatoes and herbs. And then never planted. I thought about a Saturday in July, when I had spent 6 hours getting the drainage right, because I wanted it to last. That detail stayed with me for a while. I don't know why it was the one that got through. I drove to Raleigh 2 days later to see Phil. We had been roommates freshman year before I went to flight school. And he went to law school, and he now handled family law, real estate, and divorces with a kind of frequency that had stopped making him flinch at any version of the story. I laid everything on his kitchen table. Bank statements, screenshots, a written timeline organized the same way I organized maintenance logs. The pregnancy test, documented in photographs. Phil read through all of it without speaking. When he finished, he leaned back and looked at me. Tell me what you want the end to look like, he said. I want to leave, I said. All of it. The house, the accounts, the life. Legally, cleanly and finished before she realizes it started. He stopped being my friend and became my lawyer. The house was in my name, purchased before the marriage. I had carried the mortgage almost entirely through the first 2 years and remained the primary contributor after. In North Carolina, with the documentation I had, her claim to separate property was weak. The joint checking held just under $90,000, the majority of which I could trace to my paychecks, and a Captain Track's assigning bonus. Phil walked me through every step, with the calm, unhurried precision of someone who had done this hundreds of times and understood that precision was what I needed. Not sympathy. But before any of it, before the accounts, the papers, the process server, there was a Sunday at my parents' house that I need to tell you about. Because that is the part that mattered most. It was framed as my uncle's birthday gathering. The kind of afternoon that happens dozens of times in a family's life, without meaning anything. My father at the grill, my mother carrying bowls of potato salad from the kitchen. In 2 trips when she could have done it in 1. But she liked the extra trip. My grandmother in her lawn chair near the back fence. Watching everyone with the supreme patience of a woman who had outlasted most of her opinions and kept only the essential ones. Aaron was there. Drew was there. He spent the afternoon near the far end of the patio, doing a careful, sustained impression of someone who had nothing on his mind. I watched them both. That is what those 10 days had taught me. How to watch without looking like I was watching. At some point I mentioned casually to my father that there was a transfer opportunity at our Seattle base. 3-month assignment, additional type rating hours, good for the promotion file. Good money. My mother's face changed. Not concern. Something faster and more specific than concern. Alarm converting itself into concern before I could name it clearly. My father set down his tongs. Drew turned toward the fence and studied the neighbor's yard with extraordinary interest. Can I talk to you inside for a minute? My father said. I followed him. My mother followed. So did Aunt Peggy. The sliding glass door closed and I had the brief thought that this was what it looked like when everyone else in a room already knows the end of a story and is deciding how to begin it. My father said there was something they had been trying to figure out how to tell me. My mother's voice was careful, measured, the voice she used when she wanted me to arrive somewhere. She had already decided to send me, and she wanted it to feel like I had walked there myself. She said Aaron had been struggling with being alone while I traveled. She said Drew had been spending time at the house to help out and that things had gotten complicated. She used the phrase "it's over now," past tense, closed, as if they had managed it and filed it, and I just needed to be brought up to speed. I said, "Is she pregnant?" The silence before anyone spoke was its own kind of answer. My mother said yes. I said, "How long have you known?" My father looked at my mother. 1 second, maybe less, but the look was full. It was the look of 2 people checking which version of a story they had agreed to, standing exactly at the edge of where they had decided the honesty would stop. That look was the moment I lost them, not just my trust in them, something harder to name. The version of family I had believed in since I was a child. Aunt Peggy said they had found out about 3 weeks earlier. Drew had come to them first because he didn't know what else to do. They had agreed, all of them, to tell me together. And in person, rather than over the phone. As if the delivery method was the part that required care. My grandmother appeared in the doorway, holding an empty glass. She looked at the four of us and said matter-of-factly, "Good. You told him. The way you say good when the last item on a list has been checked." I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at each of them in turn. "I need some air," I said. I went out through the garage. Not the patio where the rest of the family was pretending not to notice that something was happening inside. I stood at the end of the driveway. Drew came around the side of the house 2 minutes later. He stopped about 6 feet away. He had the expression of someone who had rehearsed multiple versions of what he was about to say, and now couldn't remember which one he had landed on. I looked at him. "I already told you about the moment in the hallway, when I chose not to go through the door." This was the second moment. Drew standing 6 feet away from me, and my right hand making a decision that my arm did not carry out. 4 seconds, maybe 5, of wanting to close that distance in a way that would have made the next several years much harder for me, and considerably worse for him. Then I understood it the same way I had understood it in the hallway. The moment I touched him, the story became about that. About what I did in my parents' driveway. Everything they had done, the 6 months, the meetings, the careful management of the information that was mine to have. It would all blur behind the thing I did in that driveway. I put my hands in my jacket pockets. "I'm leaving," I said. Drew said, "Mate, I'm sorry. I don't know how." "I heard you," I said. I got in my car. In the rearview mirror, my parents were on the front step. My aunt behind them, Drew standing with his hands at his sides. They all had the same expression. The expression of people watching something go differently than they planned, and not yet understanding how differently. They thought I needed to drive around and calm down. They thought I would come back angry, and then broken, and then ready to discuss a way forward. They thought this was the beginning of a hard conversation that would eventually arrive at the word forgiveness. They did not understand what they were watching. I drove to Phil's house and laid everything on his kitchen table and told him what I wanted the end to look like. 2 weeks later, a process server knocked on the glass door of Erin's studio. At 11, on a Thursday morning, she was in the middle of a consultation with a client. She was served in front of her 2 employees and a woman whose garden party she was coordinating. My phone rang 14 minutes later. I watched her name on the screen until it stopped. Then my mother, then Aunt Peggy, then Drew. I put the phone face down and did not listen to a single voicemail. The next weeks ran like a project plan. New checking account at a credit union on the other side of the city. Joint savings transferred and closed. Erin removed as beneficiary on all policies. Her car had been financed in my name, while she made minimum payments from the business account. I began the process of correcting that arrangement. Phil filed the papers and handled everything that came after. The house listed quietly within a month. No yard sign, just an agent with a contact list. We had an offer in 11 days. $380,000 cash. I accepted. Erin had until closing to remove her things. She called from a number I didn't recognize after she discovered I wasn't answering the known one. I didn't answer that one either. The DNA test came back court-ordered as part of the divorce proceedings. Drew was the father. 99.9% certainty. Phil called me with the result on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was running a pre-flight check at SeaTac, and I stood on the tarmac in the gray Pacific Northwest. Cold and felt, for the first time in months, like I could draw a full breath without it kept somewhere in my chest. I transferred to the Seattle base officially. Erin received her personal belongings, a fair accounting of the jointly accumulated furniture, and nothing more. Her attorney pushed on several points. Phil had the documentation to push back harder, and did. My family's attempts to reach me came in waves. My mother called until she understood I was not going to answer, then switched to letters. My father sent one message that said he knew he had handled it wrong, and that he missed me. Aunt Peggy wrote to say Drew and Erin were no longer together, that he was living at home again, that the baby was a girl, and that nobody in the family knew how to move forward without me in it. Drew sent exactly one text, which said he knew there was nothing to say. I agreed with him on that. I kept all of it in a folder I did not open often. Seattle helped. A new base meant new colleagues who knew me only as the quiet guy from Charlotte, who flew clean and didn't bring his problems to the crew room. I rented a small apartment in Ballard and spent the first 2 months, mostly working, running the waterfront trails, and learning which coffee shop had the best window seat for sitting without any particular purpose. That matters more than it sounds. I met Skye in December at a tide pool on the coast south of the city. She was crouched at the edge of a rock shelf, with a notebook and a transect tape, cataloging sea star recovery populations for a university research study. I nearly stepped on her equipment. I apologized. She told me to watch where I was going with a directness that wasn't unfriendly. Just accurate. We ended up talking for almost 2 hours while the tide came in and the wind picked up. And her data sheet got damp at the corners. She didn't heal me. I want to say that plainly, because people always want the story to have a person who repairs you. And that's not how any of this actually works. What she did was exist with a consistency I had forgotten was possible. When she said she would be somewhere, she was there. When she didn't want to discuss something, she said so directly instead of manufacturing a reason. When she wanted to know something about me, she asked it plainly. I had spent so long in a life where nothing was quite what it presented itself as. That plain was almost startling. We were together a year before she moved in. She brought her kayak, 3 boxes of field guides, a bag of cast iron cookware, and a yellow lab named Cormorant, who regarded me with deep professional suspicion for the first 6 weeks, before quietly deciding I was acceptable. The divorce finalized 8 months after I filed. I was never once in a room with Aaron during the process. Phil handled everything that required a face. My father's heart became a problem. About a year and a half after I left Charlotte. My mother wrote to tell me he had a procedure, that it had gone well, but that the cardiologist had said the underlying condition required serious lifestyle changes. Or the next cardiac event would be worse. She didn't say the stress of the family situation was a factor. She didn't need to. The letter was written around the shape of that implication. I called his cardiologist's office, identified myself, confirmed he was being treated and stable. Then I went home. The second letter came from my father himself, 18 months after that. His handwriting was smaller than I remembered. Tighter, like he was trying to fit more into less space. He wrote that he had spent a long time trying to understand the decision he had made. To know, to organize how and when I would be told, to manage the timing of my own life's information. As if that were something that belonged to him. He said he had told himself it was to protect me. He said he understood, now that he had been protecting the shape of the family, not the person in it. He wrote that he knew I would not come back, and that he had stopped expecting me to. He said he loved me. He said he was sorry, he hadn't made that the first thing instead of the last. I read the letter twice on the back porch in Ballard. Cormorant was asleep against my leg. Sky came outside, looked at me and didn't say anything. Which is one of the things I have come to understand as a form of love. My father wrote, I said. She sat beside me. She didn't reach for the letter. Are you okay? She asked. I think so, I said, and I meant it with the most honesty I could manage. Do you want to go see him? I looked at the water for a while. I don't know. She nodded. No lecture, no accounting of what I owed. Just her sitting beside me, while I figured out what I thought. I carried the question for 4 days. I thought about my father at the grill in his backyard, about him setting down the tongs and saying, "Can I talk to you for a minute?" and leading me into a kitchen full of people who had already decided how my story was supposed to go. I thought about my grandmother in the doorway, with her empty glass saying, "Good, you told him." Like the entire exercise had been a task that was now complete. I thought about the driveway. The 6 feet between me and Drew. The 4 seconds when I had a choice and made it. On the 4th night, I stood at the kitchen counter with the letter in my hand. I read it one more time. Then I folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and placed it in the drawer where I kept things I hadn't decided about yet. I did not go back to Charlotte. 7 months after the letter arrived, Phil called on a Wednesday morning to tell me my father had passed. His heart, after the second procedure, hadn't held what the cardiologist had hoped. The funeral was that Saturday. I flew a Charlotte route that weekend, by scheduling coincidence. I sat in the left seat at 37,000 feet, somewhere over Tennessee, while my father was buried 200 miles below me, and for about 40 minutes I held that fact in my mind. With a steadiness that surprised me. Then I ran the descent calculations and brought the aircraft through the cloud layer and landed where I was supposed to land. Sky and I got married the following spring on the coast, near the tide pool where we had met. Her older brother officiated. 2 of my co-workers from Seattle stood with me. It was cold, the wind came off the water, and Cormorant tried to participate more than anyone had planned for. It was the most honest thing I had ever been part of. I have thought about my cousin's daughter sometimes. She didn't choose any of this. She arrived into a story that was already written, and will spend part of her life being someone's consequence, before she is entirely her own person. I don't wish her anything but the most ordinary life possible. But sadness isn't obligation. And her parents' guilt was never my debt to carry. Some people will say I wasted years. They'll say forgiveness is the gift you give yourself, not the other person. They'll say my father died without seeing me, and that I made that happen. They're not entirely wrong. What they don't account for is the question underneath all of it. A gift I give myself in exchange for what exactly? For sitting at a holiday table while Drew passes the rolls? For my mother telling the story of how the family went through something hard but came back together. For being the mechanism by which everyone else got to feel better about what they had done. I thought about that trade for a long time. I made my decision. Sky and I moved to a house outside Port Townsend 2 years ago. Her research station is 40 minutes away. I commute to SeaTac when I'm scheduled to fly and come home to her. And the dog in the garden she planted along the back fence when I'm not. The raised beds are full now. She grew tomatoes last summer. They were, she told me with complete seriousness, the best tomatoes she had ever had in her life. I told her I was glad. I meant it all the way down. My mother's letters stopped about a year after my father died. The last one said, she was going to respect my silence, that she hoped the version of me, that knew she was sorry might someday find peace with it. I read it on the porch. I held it for a while. I put it in the drawer with the others. I do not think about them much anymore. Not because what happened became nothing, it didn't. But because it's old enough now that it knows how to stay quiet. It has learned its place. What I think about is the route I flew last Tuesday. The coastal fog, on approach. The way the runway lights resolve out of gray at 200 feet. That specific second of clarity, after a long period of not being able to see clearly. I think about the tide pool. Where a woman with a transect tape told me to watch where I was going. And turned out to be someone whose word I could take at face value. I think about the garden and the dog and the sound the house makes in the early morning when I have been away for 4 days. And everything in it is still. And mine. They wanted me to be the person who stayed. The person who sat at the table and absorbed what had happened. And rearranged himself around it. So that the shape of the family could stay intact. I understood, eventually, that this was the one thing I could refuse them. Not out of cruelty, not even entirely out of anger. Out of a clear and simple understanding that some things are not recoverable, and that building a life on top of one of those things is not resilience. It is just a longer way of losing. Family is not the people who manage your pain for their own comfort. Family is the people who never put you in a position where you have to find that out. I learned that in a driveway in Charlotte with my hands in my pockets. I have not needed to learn it again.